Welcome to the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Collective Impact Granting Stream webinar. In this webinar, we'll talk about the backbone infrastructure of collective impact effort with a focus on the 6 core roles. Thank you so much for joining us today. Liz Weaver is the Director of the Learning Center and Tamarac's Vice President. Liz helps initiatives develop their frameworks of change, supports and guides their projects, and helps connect them with other comprehensive community collaborations. She has also been director for the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, which was recognized with the Canadian Urban Institute's David Crombie Leadership Award in 2009. In her career, Liz has held leadership positions with the YWCA Hamilton, Volunteer Hamilton, and Volunteer Canada. I'll now turn things over to Liz.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And Stephanie's going to be advancing the slides, so if you hear me say next slide, it's really instructions to Stephanie to help me in the background. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the webinar. I want to apologize for the quick change in the dates. I know many of you signed up for the webinar for tomorrow, but I'm on a plane at the same time, so I apologize for the quick change, but hopefully we'll get you either live, hearing the webinar live, or listening to the recording. So this webinar is really going to be focusing on the backbone infrastructure in collective impact, as Stephanie mentioned, and it's also going to be focusing on kind of the core roles, some of the things that you need to think about backbones. We're going to start first, though, with a little bit of an overview or review of collective impact. Those of you that have joined us on previous webinars, you'll already have heard this, but for those of you for whom this is the first time you're joining us on a webinar, I think it's important to ground us in the preconditions and conditions of collective impact, and then we'll spend some time on the backbone roles and explore some different types of backbone structures. So on to next slide. So what is collective impact? By now we should all know what it is, but we will often use this definition in our presentations at Tamarack. It comes from the work of John Kenya and Mark Kramer, the folks at FSG who wrote the initial articles about collective impact, and they say that it is the commitment of a group of important actors from different sectors to actually working together on a common agenda to solve a specific social problem, and this is what's most important, using a structured form of collaboration. And so if you think about common agenda, mutually reinforcing activities, backbone, those are the elements of structure. So that's kind of the structured form of collaboration which we're going to focus on today. Next slide, Stephanie. What we know collective impact is that it's not collaboration as usual. We're really actually moving to the next iteration of collaboration, really getting these important actors to say, you know what, here's a complex social problem in our community, we want to move the needle on it. It certainly isn't a single sector approach. We know to really have a collective impact, we need collective, right? That's an important element of it. So it's not single sector, it's not focused on individual programs, and it's actually not looking at short-term impacts. It's really driving to larger scale policy, systems, and environmental change. Next slide. There are 3 preconditions. So as you're forming your collective impact initiatives, or even if your collective impact initiatives are underway already, you want to pay attention to these preconditions. One is influential champions. So it's really who are those champions that we need to have around our collective impact table, but also involve some way in our collective impact efforts, and how do we get their spheres of influence involved? What's the urgency that our community feels around this issue, and how do we know that the issue is urgent and important to our community? What's our community talking about? Are they talking about things that are related to our issue? And then the final precondition, which actually ties very closely into the notion of backbone, is do we have adequate resources, human and financial resources, to actually take on this whole community approach to solving a complex community issue. Next slide. the 5 conditions of collective impact, and this is actually the frame, right, that we're all working with. The 5 conditions really talk to the ideas of a common agenda. We are the influential champions that we've got around the table. We're agreeing to work together on something. We have a shared vision for change, which includes that kind of common understanding of the problem. We kind of know the scope and the scale of the problem, all of us around the table, and we've agreed that we're going to try to solve this problem together utilizing the unique skills that each of us has, or the unique set of resources that each of us has. Shared measurement is about using data and collecting data to make sure that we're making progress on the problem that we've identified and that we are holding each other accountable. Mutually reinforcing activities is leveraging the different resources that we have in a way that makes a difference. Continuous communications is really making sure that we're talking to one another, that all of the various community partners that we have engaged in this work are moving forward, that we're moving forward on the mutual objectives, and that we continue to really focus on kind of that shared vision for change that we've all agreed to. And then backbone support is really the infrastructure, the dedicated staff, the lead volunteer team that's really moving the collective impact effort forward. I often say that common agenda, shared measurement, and mutually reinforcing activities are the it, and continuous communications and backbone support are the how of collective impact. But it is important in collective impact efforts to really embrace the 5 conditions. I was chatting with someone earlier this morning, and I said, you know what, collective impact, the 5 conditions, the preconditions and 5 conditions are simple rules, right? They are the way that we kind of hang this form of collaboration together. Next slide. And now we're going to really focus on the backbone infrastructure. And so when the first articles appeared about collective impact, they didn't call it infrastructure, they called it backbone support or backbone organization. And what we've come to learn in the time since those first articles about collective impact, that backbone looks different in different kinds of contexts, right? And so a better way of describing backbone is really that kind of infrastructure that helps move collective impact efforts forward. And backbone can be a combination of a staffing group that is taking on some of the day-to-day staffing of the backbone and supporting it. And it can also be the core leadership team. So that's really what I like to think about backbone infrastructure. But as you'll see, there's many different iterations of it. There are 6 core functions of a backbone, and these 6 core functions really align quite significantly with the 5 conditions of collective impact. So aligned with the idea of a common agenda, the backbone helps to guide the vision and strategy. They're the ones, you know, whether it's the staffing or the leadership, they're the ones that say, okay, so how is the work that we're setting out for ourselves, how is this aligned with our vision and strategy? The other thing that backbones do is they support aligned activities. So they might establish working groups or action teams. They might reach out to pre-existing groups in the community, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to align these activities in the shared vision and the shared mission of the collective impact effort. They will be the ones for both identifying shared measurements, that establishment of shared measurement, but then they might be the group that also gathers a working group together to focus on the whole idea of shared measurement and actually looking at, you know, what are we measuring, how is what we're measuring showing that we're making progress, and then what are we learning from their measures. So that's more than just establishing. They might also, in some cases, the backbone infrastructure might also be the folks that bring the measures together, report out the measures, and then really enable the learning component of shared measurement to move forward. Backbones are often a core leader in terms of building public will, and I think this really means reaching deeper into the community beyond the leadership table beyond your core partners and really getting the community to buy into whatever issue you're working on, whether it's around obesity prevention or poverty reduction. It's really bringing your community together and movement building in some way around that issue. Backbones take on a leadership role in terms of both identifying the policy change agenda, but also looking for ways to advance policy change. Now, policy change can happen at the big P policy level. So what are we doing, with our local government or our provincial or state government or even federal governments? What are some policy issues there? But it can also be small P policies, right, which are, really focused on how are partners around the table working together, and what are some of those small P policies that have to be put into place within our partners to really for them to be able to work together more effectively. And then the final kind of role of a backbone is to mobilize funding. So it's really to look at, what funding is required, what resources are required to move this work forward, whether it's around, shared measurement or around community engagement, the building of public will. What do we need to be able to do that, and then how do we mobilize some of that funding to help support the collective impact initiative in its work and in its objectives. So those are the 6 core roles of a backbone. These 6 roles actually came out of some writing that and research that FSG did with the Community Foundation of Greater Cincinnati, where they looked at the roles of a backbone, and so they started to identify, these as 6 core roles. Next slide. If we can move this forward a little bit so that we get the complete picture, Stephanie. One more. Great, one more. So this is a collective impact backbone design that we find particularly useful. This comes from some work that was done in Canada by Tanya Sermon and Mark Sermon, who are with the Center for Social Impact, and it's called the Constellation model of governance. And it applies that we've kind of adapted it a little bit from that article. It is really interesting to think about collective impact not as a vertical hierarchy, but something that is more horizontal, where the groups are more working together. So what we have here in terms of a backbone design is we have often a steering committee. Sometimes there are subsets of the steering committee, but this is really your leadership table in your collective impact effort. And then you have your backbone kind of infrastructure, right? So it could be a single organization, or it could be a set of organizations, or it could be led by staff. But on that side of the picture, they're providing kind of the strategic guidance and the overall support to moving the common agenda and the shared metrics forward. On the other side are a number of working groups or action teams or community partner initiatives that might be pre-existing or might be developed as part of the work. And so that's where the partner-driven action happens. That's the kind of on-the-ground work that happens in the community. And so a collective impact effort is really trying to leverage the on-the-ground work, so the work of the working groups or the action teams or the pre-existing initiatives, with the kind of common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, ideas of the collective impact initiative. It's kind of melding them together to move forward on the issue that you're trying to move. And you can see that there's lots of kind of movement back and forth. So the steering committee will inform the working groups and the ecosystem. The working in groups will inform the backbone infrastructure, and so on and so on. So it's really looking at, trying to leverage all that goes on in your community. This, I think, is a kind of a neat illustration of what it might look like. And in each of your communities, it might look a little bit different, but this at least gives you some guidance. Next slide. The next two slides are really the kind of pulling out the strategic guidance roles and then really looking at the partner-driven action. So the steering committee provides strategic direction, they champion the work. What's really important for steering committee members is to really focus on how the collective impact effort aligns with their own work. So for example, if you're a United Way and you're a member of this collective impact effort, there should be alignment between your vision, values, and strategies with the collective strategies. And that should be the case for all of the partners around the table. Public sector partners, voluntary sector partners, community partners, private sector partners, and even citizens that are around the table. Some steering committee members might also serve as chairs of the working group. The backbone infrastructure is the dedicated staff, and they support the work of the partners by assisting with strategic guidance, supporting aligned activities, etc. Next slide. In terms of the partner-driven action, there's two elements to this. There are the people that are involved in working groups or action teams or however you want to call them. And there's no rule that says you have to call them a working group, although some groups do. Some people call them action teams, other people call them other names, right? So they're usually comprised of cross-sector community partners, and they're targeting a particular element of the common agenda or a number of elements of the common agenda. And they will design and implement strategies, levering the resources that they have. There might also be, in the larger ecosystem, some other community partners that might not necessarily be directly affiliated with a working group, but they might identify leverage opportunity for the collective impact effort to move forward. And so they might say, oh, here's a policy, or as a business, I'm willing to do this, or as an agency, I'm willing to do this. And so it really allows the community to not only work intentionally in terms of the working group, but also reach out to some of these unanticipated opportunities that might come forward from a larger range of community partners. Next slide. So in that writing that FSG did with the Community Foundation of Cincinnati, of Greater Cincinnati, they also started to identify, what are we looking for in terms of backbone leaders? And these were some key characteristics that they identified as, the types of characteristics that you might want to draw around your leadership table, around your staffing table, and even around your working group table. So they want to have people who are visionary but results-oriented, right? Or visionary and results-oriented. People that should be collaborative relationship builders that are focused on the goal but adaptive in their strategy. So if something new appears, that you can adapt. You can say, yes, we're driving towards this goal of reducing poverty in our community, but here's something that just came up that we want to adapt to, that are charismatic and influential communicators, that have political savvy, and that also have humility, that don't always have to be at the lead, that they sometimes can be a member of a working group and lead that way, or they can be, they don't always have to be the spokesperson for the leadership table. And this is a little bit of these things sometimes seem like they are in conflict with one another, right? Visionary but humble seems to be a conflict, but that's the kind of leadership that you want to draw to this table. It doesn't necessarily have to sit in one individual. I really look at this list and think about, okay, so who around the leadership table or the backbone table or the working groups that we have, who brings these competencies to the table? And then if we're, trying to drive on our common agenda, can we bring the visionary folks to the forefront? If we're really focusing on shared measurement, is that where we bring those people that are really results-oriented to help us do the thinking? So really look upon these, characteristics as a broader spectrum of characteristics. And here's how, if you can move to the next slide, Stephanie. Here's how one group actually talked about or wrote. They were recruiting people to their leadership table, and this is how they wrote it, utilizing some of these characteristics. So they were saying, you know, we need collaborative leaders, we need communicators, we need people who can, you know, understand different language used by stakeholders in the community and can be a bridge to various communities and groups. And this is, you know, true when we're bringing in business leaders and government leaders. Are they leaders that are also translators of their, you know, of the business community or of government? We want people who are lifelong learners, who have that kind of political astuteness or political savvy, that are strategic and that are practical. I find this kind of framing really, really helpful in terms of thinking about collective impact. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, there are different types of backbones, and they come from different kinds of structures. And often in collective impact, there's a group that convenes the initial discussion who might step into the role of backbone, or there might be a group that says, okay, I'm going to, you know, I'm going to be the fiscal agent and host the initiative moving forward. And they come from, you know, different sectors and different segments of our community. So an example is the Calgary Homeless Foundation, which is a funder. So the funder in this case is driving the homeless strategy forward in the city of Calgary. And we've seen lots of examples where United Ways have stepped up into this role as convening and hosting the backbone, both in Canada and the United States. And we've seen other examples where community foundations have stepped into this role. In some cases, they might become new nonprofits. And so the Community Center for Education Results is, you know, they form themselves as a new nonprofit, and they are hosting the backbone and the backbone infrastructure. And you see that often in education, where it becomes a brand new 501c3 or a brand new charitable organization. In some cases, the backbone sits within an existing nonprofit, and here's an example of it sitting within an existing nonprofit where the, you know, the existing nonprofit says, you know, yes, we're going to continue to do the core work of our nonprofit, but we're going to host this element of our collaborative work through this backbone infrastructure and support. So they're almost like they're a fiscal agent and supporting the backbone. And what's really important in terms of all of these is that there's alignment. Mission and the vision and the values of an existing nonprofit, the mission, the vision, and the values of government or of the funders as well. In some cases, they sit within a government agency, so the government agency hosts and convenes the backbone, and in some cases, they're shared across multiple organizations. What's really interesting is not so much that it's one of these, it really is what do you need in your community and who is willing to step up to the role of hosting, you know, that convening the collective impact work and hosting the backbone infrastructure, or do you need to set up a new nonprofit? Next slide. This work comes from the work of FSG, some of the thinking of FSG in the Collective Impact Forum around how do you set up a backbone if you're very new to this process. And so there are three kind of ways that have been seen as establishing backbones. One is that you have a fully open process, right, where you do a landscape scan of the key players, including the usual suspects, but actually going beyond the usual suspects, that you talk about how you think in your community the role of the backbone will play out and what the backbone might look like. You approach high potential backbone organizations to assess their interest in serving as the backbone kind of fiscal agent, the backbone support. You issue a RFP and you go through the whole process. Some of the pros are that there's transparency in this process. It builds credibility, that it's open to many different kinds of organizations with different skill sets. The cons are that to go through this process takes time, right? The semi-open process is that And we've seen the semi-open process actually happen in lots of collective impact initiatives from Tamarack's perspective, where there is a group that identifies itself and says, yeah, you know what, we're willing to play this kind of convener, fiscal agent, host of the backbone in the early stages, right? And so we'll try it out, and we may move it forward or not. Or we might do it for a number of years and then pass it on to another group in the community to move it forward, or the kind of the entity becomes its own charitable initiative or 501c3 initiative. The pros are that there's an ability to try some things out and see if they work. The cons are that it might be politically difficult, right? That and it might be inefficient to switch backbones over time. One of the things that we've been learning at Tamarack is, and observing as we watch this stuff evolve, is that this is actually a fairly consistent process with collective impact initiatives. We've seen lots of collective impact initiatives at the year 4, year 5, maybe even sometimes earlier, actually switch out from one kind of fiscal agent hosting the backbone to another fiscal agent in the community hosting the backbone. And then the final example of backbones is that they're predetermined, right? So the leadership table says, they look around the table and they say, you know, based on our existing knowledge of the community, makes a lot of sense that would you be willing to step up to the plate and be the backbone? And so they name someone, and that becomes the backbone kind of infrastructure. Or in other cases, groups step up to the plate and say, pick me, right? So they name themselves. And so then that group actually goes on to recruit a steering committee and then the advisory group, and it brings on funders and other partners. The pros is that it's fairly easy to do and fairly short term, or it helps kind of move the process forward in the short term. The cons are that some people in the community might say, well, why did they get picked and not me? And so if you go to the predetermined process in terms of structuring your backbone, there should be a set of criteria that say, you know, we picked this group to, you know, host the backbone and be the fiscal agent of the backbone because of this set of reasons, right? So we've seen all three of these processes occur in communities and in terms of community change. And I think at the end of the day, it's what works for your community moving it forward. Next slide, Stephanie. So the next slide really looks at building sustainability and support over the short term with your backbones. And so this is really kind of thinking through you know, how do we keep our backbones resilient and sustainable over the long term? And so we have identified that sustainability really does come through multiple funding streams. That if you are a collective impact initiative that only has one funder in place, that makes you a little bit less resilient over the longer term. And so you want to think about, you know, particularly around the leadership table of your backbone, you know, who do we have around our table and how can they potentially invest in this work? Whether it's investing through direct dollars or it's investing by lending staff or lending resources, hosting websites, hosting the shared measurement element of your collective impact initiative. So to really think about how do we get the work done. It's not necessarily the traditional way, right? To really be open to the opportunities that you might have in front of you. Next slide, Stephanie. So we have a couple of tools and resources, and I'm going to stop here for a second and just say if you have any questions, in a few minutes we're going to open this up to questions and conversation. So if you have any questions about backbones or about governing backbones or setting up your backbone structure, put them into the chat box and I'll turn over to Heather in a few minutes to raise some of the questions and we can have a bit of a back and forth about that. So here are some tools and resources that you might find particularly helpful depending on where you are in the framing of your backbone. So I've just been thinking a lot about different kinds of backbone structures and the pros and cons of these different kinds of backbone structures. And I put a blog together recently, which, takes, if you're a government backbone, government-hosted backbone, what are the pros and cons of that? If you're a separate charity, what are the pros and cons of that? So please feel free to go to that blog, and then if you have some suggestions, if you have any ideas, if you want to add into the discussion about your own structure and what you've been learning, please comment on that blog. The Collective Impact Forum has a really great resource called Tools for Backbones. So you can find it there through the link to the Collective Impact Forum. They also have a template for budgeting. So if you are in the early stages of forming your backbone, they've actually put together a bit of an Excel spreadsheet that can be a template for your budget and what you need to be thinking about in terms of your budget. And early on in their work, FSG put together an article called Measuring Backbone Contributions to Collective Impact. And so I have a link to that article as well. So these are some really good tools and resources that are available in terms of thinking about backbone structures and thinking about how, where you are in your backbone journey and what you might do in terms of your design and your structure and some of the governance elements that you want to be building into your structure. So with that, I'm going to end the core content of the webinar. I want to now turn it over to Heather and say, Heather, are there any questions that anybody raised in terms of some of the content that I presented?
Hi, Liz. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. And we do have a few questions. One of them is why is the backbone structure important for collective impact?
So that's a really good question. And so having a backbone, actually, what's interesting about what makes collective impact different than normal collaboration is this notion of a backbone, right? This notion that there will be a group of people that are paying attention to moving the collective impact initiative forward. So often with collaborative tables that I've sat around, and I'm sure that you sat around, we're doing the busy work of our organization, and then we go to the collaborative table, and for the hour that we're meeting, we might talk about our shared or collaborative work, and then we go back to the busy work of our organization. So the collaborative work is something that we do at the side of our desk, not at the center of our desk. And so a backbone infrastructure is actually moving the collaborative work from the side of the desk to the center of the desk and giving, some folks responsibility to pay attention, continually pay attention that this work is at the center of the desk, right? That the common agenda is moving forward, that we're measuring our progress as we go, that we are looking at opportunities to mutually align and reinforce activities. And so that's really the core work of a backbone. It's just giving it some resources to make sure that, collective impact moves to the center of the desk.
Okay. We have another question. This is a really good one. So it's going back to that slide about the steering committee and the backbones. Yeah. And if the question is that the steering committee and the backbone are one the same. So is this a good thing, or is there some potential downfalls to this?
Well, that's actually a very good question. So if you go to the blog that I've done about different backbone structures, there is one type of backbone structure that I identified where it's an all-volunteer structure, right? And this is you sometimes see this in communities where there isn't enough resources to hire staff to lead the backbone, and so then the steering committee and it's kind of all mushed into one. If that's the reality of your community, that's what you have to work with, right? And so what's really important in that kind of an approach to a backbone is to really say, okay, so what are the strategic roles that we're going to play as a steering committee, And then what are some of the administrative roles that we're going to play, and how do we set up some guidelines around the administrative functions and the guidelines around the strategic functions. And this is particularly true when you have things like funding coming into your collective impact effort, right? Because you don't want to have one group benefit, outrageously than other groups around your table. Nothing decreases levels of trust when that happens. So you want to be able to say, okay, so administratively, if we get some resources to help this work go forward, this is how we're going to make decisions about how those resources are allocated, right? So what are the administrative decisions that we have to make? What are some of the agreements that we have around the administrative decisions? And then for the strategic decisions, how do we as a table move those strategic decisions forward? So, there's lots of parallels. For those of us that work in voluntary sector organizations, there's lots of parallels between board and staff and, that kind of thing. And sometimes there are voluntary sector organizations that are all volunteer, right? And they also struggle with these kinds of things. So you can think about them that way. So the pros are, that people are really engaged because they're not only doing strategic work and they're also doing, the administrative work. The cons are that, I think in that example, sometimes the collective impact effort still sits at the side of the desk, right? And so, you've got to think about, okay, so how do we intentionally, recognizing that we all have our own work at our own organizations, how do we intentionally continue to move this collective impact effort to the center of the desk? It's not that it can't be done. I think it does require a little bit more thinking and a little bit more figuring out what the structures are and what the decision-making processes are and how you separate out strategic from administrative, and that each meeting isn't always burdened by just the administrative.
Great. Brenda, who asked that question, said that she has a part-time paid coordinator who reports to the committee.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's good. So then that's the part-time paid coordinator is, working with the leadership table to bring it to the center of the desk. But part-time can be challenging, right? Because the staff person, the part-time paid coordinator, that's an interesting role in collective impact because they, in some ways, are supporting the leadership table, but in other ways are also working with the working groups or the community change or the community groups to kind of move stuff forward. So in those cases, you want to say, okay, so what can our table do? What are the responsibilities of this part-time paid coordinator? What are our expectations of other partners? So to really start to think through, what it looks like from a delivery perspective.
So ideally, a full-time person would help in the sustainability and the resilience of the group.
Well, yeah, ideally yes, but that's not always the case, Heather. Sometimes the reality in some communities is that the best you can afford is a part-time person. What you might then do, if that's the case, is look to the other people around your leadership table and say, do you have resources within your organization that you might lend to this collective impact effort? So, sometimes in Hamilton, what we did when we were leading our poverty reduction effort is we went to our local planning council who did research and we said, would you take on community research as your contribution to our collective impact work? And then we went to another table that was really good at setting up websites. And we said, would you be willing to take on, or another organization, would you be willing to take on the setting up of our website? Because you've got some expertise in that area. So it's really, leveraging as much of the resources of the folks that we have around our table to support the part-time person as well.
Great. And she actually says part-time is challenging. She agreed.
Absolutely.
The next question is is about the steering committee, or is about strategic planning and building your plan and your work groups, and what the role of the the backbone would be in that?
Yeah, so that's really good. So a really nice way of aligning your leadership table or your steering committee table with the work of the work groups is to have someone on your steering committee also be on the work groups, right? So, you know, some collective impact initiatives have the chairs of the work groups also be on their steering committee, so there's this kind of back and forth initiative between the partner action and the strategic action, and they're kind of all working in lockstep. Another way of doing that, if you don't do that, is to have kind of quarterly meetings of everybody, you know, your working group and your steering committee, just to make sure that you're on track. Some other ways to keep everybody kind of moving in the same direction is to use things like we have a tool that we can include, Heather, in our post mail out called a key milestone report. And a key milestone report is a high-level document that just shows the progress of the collective impact initiative overall. And the key milestone report might be something that when you set up a new working group, you use it as an orientation tool, or when new people come to the steering committee, it's an orientation tool for them. And it's really saying, here are the key decisions that we've made throughout our journey, our collective impact journey. Here's how we've progressed in our work, and here's how we think we're going forward. So there are tools that really, and this is where, you know, continuous communications, I think it's a brilliant condition of collective impact, right? You've got to focus on continuous communication when you've got so many of these elements coming into play. So you really want to think about, you know, what do our working groups need? What kind of information do they need to get their work done? At Tamarack, we use this phrase, and my colleague Mark Holmgren used it in the last webinar. Who needs what information, packaged how, for what purpose? So what does our steering committee need? How do we what kind of information do they need? How do we package it? And what do we hope they will do with it? What do our working groups need in terms of information? How do we package it for them? And what do we hope they'll do with it? So to continuously think about, you know, the different elements that we've built into the design that we have of our, you know, infrastructure, and then how do we, you know, build a continuous communications loop with them? The whole thing continues to move, you know, in synchronicity. I think we have time for one more question, Heather.
Okay, this is a good one. They're trying to involve community groups and individuals who are not part of an organization or an established organization, and they are wanting to know, how do you involve them in the backbone structure? Yeah. And what are the elements to fostering that engagement?
Sure. So if you think back to the design that I showed you, the ecosystem, the community ecosystem, there were lots of other players. There were the players around the working groups, but there was also lots of other players in the community. And when I was doing this work, I was the director of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, as you heard earlier. And we were trying to figure out, you know, what would our kind of backbone infrastructure look like. We had working groups for sure. We had a steering committee. We had a small staffing infrastructure. I think we had like 2.5 people working on our, working to support the collective impact effort moving forward. But then we came across this idea called community solutions. And it was actually quite brilliant. It wasn't our idea. Someone shared it with us, and we thought, oh, that's a great idea. So this was a way that we reached out to the broader community, and we said, okay, so here's how we're moving forward. Here's our common agenda, how we're going to reduce poverty for children and their families in the city of Hamilton. If you have a solution that aligns with our common agenda, that fits with our kind of way that we've designed the change that we want to see, and you want to be considered a community solution, we would love to welcome you, right? And so we reached out and we heard from people in the community who were already doing work, who didn't necessarily want to sit at one of our working groups, but they felt like their work was aligned with the collective impact effort. And so what we did, we would have this annual gathering of folks, of community members to report out on our progress. So we always had a report to the community, and we built these posters that really represented these community solutions. And the posters were built with the partners. So it was the partners provided content about their community solution and what they were trying to do to address the issue of child poverty in the city of Hamilton, and some successes that they were making and some partners that they were engaging in this work. And what was really interesting was over the course of 3 years, we went from having 33 of these community solutions to 175 of them. And they all aligned with our overall strategy. And some of them actually then became working groups, or we took to the next level. But what was really important about that was recognizing that the roundtable was one player in this, that we had a focus, and that we could also invite others in. And so I think that's I think the really important part about collective impact. That's the collective part about collective impact, is to really be able to embrace some of the shifts that are happening in your community and how you can really work with the partners who want to be involved. Maybe we can include some examples of those posters of community solutions, Heather, in our post-event email, so that people can see what we did in Hamilton and what that looked like.
Okay, yeah, and there's 3 more questions, and what we'll do is we'll include those in the post with some answers, because we don't have time to get to them.
Yeah, and the final thing that I want to say before we move on to the wrapping up of the webinar, recently I was asked by the Collective Impact Forum to talk about backbone governance, and so I was kind of the ask an expert, and I'm by no means an expert, but I have been doing some thinking about this, and so we'll include a link to that conversation about backbone governance as well, because people posted questions there, and then my job was to kind of come up with resources or responses to their questions. And so people who are engaged with Backbone might find that thread of conversation helpful to them, depending on where they are. Okay, so if we can move to the next slide, Stephanie. As we mentioned, this is part of a series of capacity building webinars that Tamarack is partnering with the Ontario Trillium Foundation around. And the reason why we're partnering with the Ontario Trillium Foundation is that the Ontario Trillium Foundation is interested in building capacity of organizations across the province of Ontario in terms of collective impact. And so this slide talks about the mission and the impact of the Ontario Trillium Foundation. So you can see that they invest in 1,000 organizations across Ontario on an annual basis, that they are one of Canada's largest granting foundations, and that over the next year in Ontario alone they will be investing in over $1 billion, and a portion of that money will be invested to seed collective impact across the province of Ontario. So next slide. So their goal is to bring fundamental change with collective impact, and so they have, for those of you that are in the province of Ontario, you can find out more about their collective impact granting stream if you look on their website and you go under this icon, which is around collective impact grants. Next slide. And they really think in their collective impact approach, they want to enter into a conversation with you about collective impact work. So you can visit their page about what they fund, but more importantly, if you're a collective impact, a startup collective impact initiative in Ontario, we would suggest that you call them. You call your local program manager and you begin a conversation with them about the idea, about what you're working on, and about how you're bringing, how your vision for collective impact is moving the needle on the issue that you want to move the needle on. Next slide.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. That was a really great webinar, and thank you everyone for your comments and questions. It made it very thought-provoking. Just before we wrap up, I want to shed some light on our upcoming events and some opportunities that you all have to continue learning with us. Our most notable multi-day event is happening September 26th to 30th, and it's our Community Change Institute in Toronto. If you want to know more about this or have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, Stephanie at tamarackcommunity.ca. We also have some upcoming one-day events, September 12th and September 15th on the West Coast, and another multi-day event happening in November, evaluating community impact. If you didn't get enough of Liz today, she will be there, and it is no doubt going to be a great event as well. We also have some upcoming webinars, another Ontario Trillium Foundation webinar on Thursday, September 8th, and then Community Change webinar on September 1st and September 12th, again with Mark, and one of our speakers, Francis Wesley, on September 1st. If you want to sign up for those, we'll be circulating registrations for that as well. So again, thank you all so much. Thank you, Liz. And if you have any feedback for us, please feel free to reach out to myself. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you again.